I'm pleased to introduce our speaker for this session on navigating river debris hazards. Jeff Hammond is a Colorado Parks and Wildlife Ranger at the Arkansas Headwaters Recreation Area. The AHRA brings together a patchwork of federal, state, and local public lands along a 152-mile stretch of the Upper Arkansas under the management of a single state park. Jeff joined the AHRA team in 2017, where he supervises river patrol, teaches swiftwater rescue, and established the Every Kid in a Life Jacket program, distributing over 600 free PFDs to Arkansas Valley third graders each year. So thanks so much, Jeff. I'll hand that over to you.
Thank you all again for having me join you today. My name is Jeff Hammond. As Miranda said, I'm a park ranger at the Arkansas Headwaters Recreation Area. And here to talk to you about how we manage debris hazards, particularly in the context of the Arkansas River. So this talk is not meant to be gospel, but just meant to be one approach to the solution. And I'd really like to spark conversation and learn from you all as well, some of those other approaches that are out there. So just to start off a little bit about the Arkansas Headwaters Recreation Area. I think the context of the area I work is important in determining our approach to the hazards we deal with. We are a state park that's about 150 miles long. Some of that land is federal, state, and local owned, but it's all managed collectively as a state park. There's significant private land throughout the river corridor. The river flows through, towns, cities, ranches, kind of all of the above. We get about 1.2 million visitors to the park a year, and we manage 45 commercial permittees, most of those being whitewater boating, float fishing, and walk and wade fishing. Collectively, they have about 250,000 boating clients a year, and we also see an additional 80,000 or so private boaters a year. The sections of river that we manage range all the way from Class 1 to Class 5. We also have 3 developed whitewater parks, one in Buena Vista, one in Salida, one in Canyon City, with man-made features, sidewalks right along the side of the river, tubing, kind of that downtown attraction. And then another component that may be different from a lot of other rivers that you are all dealing with is just that we have highways moving right along the river, railroads, etc. So that all helps add to the context we're working in. Collectively, that puts us more towards one end of the spectrum of philosophies on debris removal. And in general, we probably err more towards removing debris hazards. But that's not a one-size-fits-all approach, and not something that we necessarily do every time. So to start off, I'd just like to kind of walk us through the life cycle of a hazard, which here I've broken into these 5 stages. So we're going to start off with our initial report. A tree falls in the river, and we do, in fact, hear about it. Luckily, we have a very active boating community on the river here. So in general, if there's something going on, folks let us know. And we're pretty involved in the communities we work in, so people are familiar with us as a resource to help address these. Next, we generally send out an announcement, and we really just want to share timely and relevant information with stakeholders as soon as we can, and making sure we're still doing so accurately. Next, we move to evaluation, where we're going to have our staff actually on scene gauging the relative risk that hazard poses, which I've deemed an objectively subjective analysis, because it is both. At times we've tried to develop a scorecard where it's, if you total up everything from column A and it hits a certain total, then yes, that hazard is eligible for removal. And it's just not that clean. We work in a pretty dynamic environment, and we need to have that subjective eye, and it definitely takes a while to develop that. We're always kind of training our next generation of staff who are going to be making those decisions down the road, because it's not necessarily intuitive right away. Our second to last phase is our mitigation phase, and that might range from doing nothing at all, taking no action, all the way up to complete removal. Sometimes we'll partially remove a hazard, or maybe the mitigation steps we'll take is really just that announcement and letting people know that it's there. Um, and then finally, we kind of finish up that life cycle with documentation. We want to preserve what we did for the record, whatever that record may be, but to make either our future lives or the future version of us lives easier. Um, the as you all know, with data, the best time to start recording data was 10 years ago. The second best time is today. So if down the road you might need this data on what kind of hazards you've removed, start recording that now and over record it. You never know what's going to be relevant to a future question. I'll hedge this already a little bit with we're not going to follow all of these steps every time, and we're not always going to follow them all in the same order. Sometimes I might get that initial report and it's a pretty cagey report. There's not a lot of good information. Something's not adding up in it. And maybe I move to evaluation before I send out that announcement. Particularly in a high water period where we have hazards moving around rapidly. If we know those flows are coming up and more debris is going to be picked up off the banks, existing debris is going to be relocated, that announcement, even by the time it's emailed out, might no longer be relevant. So there's already a couple things that might make us change our kind of process flow here. To start off with our initial report, we've got kind of four main ways that we're going to learn about a hazard in the river. The one I really try to point folks to in the public, in outfitters, and even for our staff internally, is a Google form that we have developed. That's publicly accessible. It's pinned on our Facebook page. It's emailed out to outfitters, so anybody can get on that, including our staff. And that all feeds into a centralized spreadsheet that we have access to. It allows us to track that hazard kind of through the lifespan and adds to that permanent record. So we can look back, and if we get a question about, why did or didn't you remove this hazard from 2 years ago, then previous staff has made notes and really tracked that hazard throughout its life cycle. There's also an alert on this Google form that goes out to all staff. So that way it's not dependent on who's working that day. We do have a pretty small community, and a lot of folks might just text me on my personal phone because we boat together on our days off, like, hey, there's a tree in the river. That's great, but if I'm out of town or on vacation or maybe not paying attention to my work phone because I'm on vacation, I don't want that to go a week delayed before staff can get to it. So using that official means of communication through the Google form is much more effective for making sure it gets to the right people. Next, the office phone and email are quite common for people to send in a report. They're just going to look up the number, give us a call. They're used to emailing us about other concerns. So that exists as well. Rather than have those people go back through and fill out the Google form, we just have our office staff then input either that phone call or that email into our Google form so we can track it just like all the other hazards. It's really important to make sure that you're coaching staff that take these reports on the proper questions to ask. And that we're getting contact info. So if you take a report over the phone or in the field, making sure that we get info for that person, a name, a phone number at least. So that way, if we're struggling to find that hazard, where they reported it, we can't seem to find it. Maybe it's metal debris in the river and the waters come up and we're not quite certain on location. We can call them back, get more info, get them to drop us a GPS pin, and continue to chase that down. Social media as well is a great source of getting hazard reports. We have a lot of local boating groups on Facebook in particular that are dedicated even to different sections of the river. So for the Canyon City area, for the Buena Vista area, for the Salida area, there might be these kind of smaller Facebook groups. I don't try to, live on the internet and moderate all of those forums, but having a good social media presence through your official accounts puts you front of mind for folks on those platforms, and they might tag you in it. That said, make sure that you have someone moderating those official platforms if you have them, because you don't want to just have all those tags and messages you've been receiving of some hazard building up and going unanswered. Definitely in a small community, it can be tempting for staff to kind of want to jump in there themselves from their personal accounts. So we just make sure that we're always training our new staff, like, this is your personal account, is for your personal time. We have official accounts to do this as well. So if people are tagging you personally in a hazard report on Facebook, don't reply, just forward that over to work. And then finally, word of mouth. We have a really strong presence out in the river corridor, especially during the boating season. Part of the reason that cooperative management agreement between the federal agencies and the park was created was to allow for more staff out there in the field. So just being present at your boat ramps, at your sites, is a huge resource to provide that opportunity for folks to ask a question, and just lingering that little bit longer, not kind of rushing through the site, doing what you need to do. We pull a lot of weeds this time of year, and you'd be surprised, when you just spend that extra time walking around pulling weeds and you're there that extra, 5-10 minutes, someone sees that ranger around and they build up the courage to come up and ask a question or give a report or whatever it might be. With that word of mouth method as well, use partners that you have. So one of the local gear shops is really good at forwarding reports that they get to us. They rent out equipment. Maybe someone comes back and says, hey, while I was out on the river, there was a tree down. And that shop is really good at forwarding those over to us. So, nurture those relationships. If you have outfitters, work with them as well. They have our commercial boating community has much more presence out on the river than our staff do. So they are really our eyes and ears in the field. One caveat I do give with this initial report is consider the source. So is this coming from a seasoned outfitter where you can trust on a pretty objective evaluation, or is this the passerby on the highway who thinks they might have seen something outside of the realm of hazards, but just kind of giving that example of considering the source? We get passerby on the highway 911 calls of, I saw something going on in the river, and it was, they saw a flipped raft and they called 911. Well, flipping rafts is part of boating. As we all know, we're all between swims. So maybe that report, before we, rally all of the search and rescue resources, we need to consider where that report is coming from. Same thing with when we get a hazard report. Next, we have a couple different mediums for sending out announcements. One of the first ones we go to is we have an email list that we maintain at the park level, a couple different lists. One of those is for outfitters. We might use that to send out permit renewal reminders, etc. And then we have another one for private boaters. So I'm going to use both of those when we have a hazard announcement. A little pro tip when you're sending out emails to these lists, BCC people to avoid that email chain from just devolving into reply chaos. But definitely BCCing those lists is very helpful to prevent it from just turning into social media. Another option is social media. So using your official accounts to push out, timely and pertinent information, and then just the community itself will share that around to various groups. We've learned of new Facebook groups we're not familiar with through people sharing our posts over to them. So it's really good at kind of that force multiplication and amplifying your message. We also have a lot of community champions out there. So we have a group called the Citizens Task Force at the park. It's essentially a citizens advisory board made up of various constituent groups from private boaters, nonprofits, landowners, outfitters. So when we have a message to put out, our CTF members are very good at relaying that to their relevant constituent groups. Official meetings are a great forum as well to get information out. We have an annual outfitter workshop that's mandatory to attend. So some kind of major hazard that's maybe a little bit more permanent. That annual meeting, just making sure folks are familiar with a new change in the river, is a good opportunity. We have monthly meetings in the off season with outfitters. And then this time of year, we go through a series of head guide meetings where the outfitters coordinate getting all their guides, their head guides together and talking about kind of concerns for the season. This year, it's low water. What are we going to portage? What's the etiquette for portaging? But that's another good opportunity to spread hazard awareness, and then to remind folks about the channel that we'd like them to report hazards through, being that Google form. And then various community events as well are always a good opportunity to spread that message. One of our communities does an annual search and rescue debrief where they get together the volunteer search and rescue organizations, the professional agencies, and just go through things that have happened in the community. So maybe there's a new change, rockfall, et cetera, and we'll try to use that as another example or another opportunity to push out that information. And then physical signage is a tried and true option. The sandwich board has probably spread more messages in our river systems than anything else. It's great. It's portable. It's easy to put up at a boat ramp when you need to have it, and then take it down when you don't. It's a pretty tried and true option. And then on river signage as well. For something like a low head dam, we have actually placed on river signage in the same style as a highway sign that extends, like big steel pole on the side of the river that extends out over the river, like exit ahead, hazard ahead. For some of those more permanent hazards, actually putting signage on the river is definitely a good option as well. So next, we're going to move into evaluating this hazard that we have received a report of. Sometimes that report, if it's credible right away, we get good photos, good location. We'll push that out to an announcement before we even get out to evaluate it in person, because we can kind of do a preliminary analysis and say, yep, this is relevant. We need to get this information out right now. And then we'll get staff on scene next to evaluate. Really, the decision here is, are we going to take a mitigation action or not? First and foremost, the question I want to ask is this safe for my team? There are hazards that are absolutely hazards that we have not been able to work on because it would not be safe for the team. And I'll have a photo coming up in the next slide of that. Do we have the proper tools and training is the next question I'm going to ask. If the answer to that is no, I'd point you back to question one, and likely the answer to question one is also going to be no. That doesn't mean it's necessarily a hard stop there. There might be other resources that you have locally that do have the proper tools and training. Mitigation operation timing is a big consideration. I don't want to have ropes stretched across the river and chainsaws out and a big complex mitigation operation on a mostly avoidable hazard on a busy boating weekend. Depending on the severity of the hazard, we might pend that for a couple of days so that we can do our mitigation operation outside of a heavy use time. Or maybe that hazard's not accessible due to high water and we need to wait for the flows to come down. I mentioned earlier, but another timing consideration is is the water coming up rapidly? Is that hazard still going to be there tomorrow? And should we go through the whole process of gearing up and getting all our resources in place, only to find that once we get down there, that log has floated away and found itself a new home? The next consideration in my evaluation is how much of the boatable channel is blocked. So is this avoidable? Is there more than 50% of the channel that folks can get around this? How strong of current is it in? Is this blockage a couple willows that are extending out into the channel? Is this a clean log extending all the way across? Or is this a fully limbed out tree with vegetation and small branches? those are all going to change my view on how much of a hazard this is and how urgent it is to remove. And then, yeah, how difficult is this hazard to avoid? So even if 80% of the channel is blocked, but that it's mostly in an eddy and all of the moving current moves straight around, through that 20% that's open, maybe that's not the hazard we need to mitigate right away. Next, I want to consider consistency with the section of river. So we all expect a certain amount of hazards in a class 5 rapid. That is the inherent risk of whitewater boating. And if we were to look to mitigate every hazard in whitewater boating, we'd make lakes. And that's not what our goal is here. To a certain extent, the hazards that exist, whether they're hydraulics or waves or big rocks in boulder gardens, add character to the river. That's why folks want to boat these sections. And it's a reasonable expectation that if there's a log 5 feet into the river in a class 5 section that's pretty easily avoidable, I can expect that the boater who's going to be in that section of river to be able to avoid that. So is the risk posed by that hazard consistent with the section and consistent with the user that's in that section? On the flip side of that, is this a river-wide strainer in a section that is popular with very inexperienced users, tubers, people just swimming, maybe a section that we don't have good life jacket compliance in? Then even if that might not be as if you just took a picture of that individual tree in a class 5 section, but then you put that in a class 2 section, suddenly I'm now going to be much more likely to remove that in a class 2 situation than the exact same objective evaluation of the hazard in a class 5 section. The complexity of a hazard. So I mentioned before, is this a single smooth log that, maybe really isn't going to pose that much of a strainer? Is it over the river and might knock people out of a boat, but it's not going to actually entrap someone? Or is it actually down in the current? Is this a fully limbed out tree? Is this a pile of trees or big, nasty root ball snags? Are there additional hazards involved in it? We have one section of the river that folks have used old cars for bank stabilization decades ago, and now the bank has eroded enough that there are rusted out chassis of 1960s cars all down the outside of a river bend. If a tree falls there and pulls one of those cars into the river with it, which we've had, that's now even a much nastier strainer than just the log would be on its own. The orientation, particularly when we're talking about woody debris, but is that log, is the crown of the tree downstream or upstream? If you think about a swimmer's course through that hazard, if all of the branching is happening downstream of them, they're less likely to get stuck versus if that crown is pointing upstream, that swimmer can now get lodged in all of those V's of the log that are pointing up towards them. And then the strength of the current as well. Is this something where a boat, a person can really get pushed into this obstacle, or is it in some pretty calm water? The final evaluation criteria that I have listed here is this an attractive nuisance? Is this going to become a sword in the stone situation where if we do not mitigate this, everyone wants to go out and test to see if they are King Arthur of the Arkansas and if they can remove that tree themselves? We've had those hazards where I've made that decision. This is not worth mitigating. It's consistent with a class 4 stretch of river. It's not in the main boatable channel, but for some reason, folks just really want to remove it, and they might make it worse. They might pose a danger to themselves, or they might get in over their head and then send part of that log into a channel where now it is blocking the boatable channel. So even though it wouldn't normally meet our criteria, is this just something we're seeing a lot of community concern about it, and it's better that we remove it versus run the risk of someone making it worse. So next we'll move into our mitigation phase, to let it be or not to let it be. So on the left here, I have a picture of a logjam we did choose to remove. And this would be, this is a class 2 section of river, often tubed, often one of the sections we see lower life jacket compliance. We do have a life jacket requirement for tubing on the Arkansas River. The type of user who's going to be down here might not be aware of the dangers of a strainer. So even though one of these logs is oriented with the crown downstream, that's still going to pose a significant hazard to the type of user we see here. And we've got logs on both sides of the river. There's really no, without making a pretty aggressive ferry, there's no way to make it through just kind of floating. On the right, we have a car that was not put in park on the boat ramp and rolled off the boat ramp. And we actually ended up having to leave this in place for quite some time because it was not safe for our staff to try to remove this. The water was rapidly coming up. This was right during our peak flow time. And the day it went in, most of this car was exposed, probably down to about the level of the hood. And then within a day, by the time we could coordinate a tow truck or enough resources to actually get this removed, the car was now fully submerged. And trying to have our staff operate around that. The windows actually pretty quickly blew out as well. So now the car itself is a strainer with broken glass. We just determined this was not worth risking our staff in this situation. The other context of the photo on the right is this is the float into the Royal Gorge. So especially at this flow, it's very much a class 5 section of river. And as you can see, it's a pretty open channel. My expectation of a boater floating into the gorge is they can probably get around that car. So this was one where we did end up removing it eventually, but we had to leave it in place until the flows came back down. Our final step, we're going to move into documentation. And the adage there is if it isn't written down, it didn't happen. We want to take pre and post operation images and video as well. Video's even better. I'd encourage folks to take pictures from multiple angles, upstream, downstream, river right, river left. And drone photos are a great asset as well if you have the ability to take those. It can really help show how much of the river is actually blocked and kind of put it in the context of that aerial view. If you have the opportunity to demonstrate people using that section of river post hazard removal, or if you're choosing not to remove a hazard, if you can demonstrate that people are navigating it safely while that hazard still is in place, take a video of boaters floating through and easily getting around it, or stage one with your staff getting through and navigating that section. Those also serve as a great way to, when you send out next that kind of alert cancellation, you can show, yep, the channel is open. Here's what it looks like now. So send out a follow-up email. If replying to that same email thread for social media posts, I prefer to actually update the original post versus posting a new one. Hazard announcements get a lot of engagement. A week later, hey, that hazard's no longer here. Well, that's old news. People don't pay attention to it anymore. So updating the original post, I edit it. I add at the top, update, this hazard has been removed, and then original post below. And then I add a comment as well. So that way people get a notification if they commented on it, et cetera. They see that there's been a reply to it, and then they can see that there's an update. Photos also serve as that documentation serves as a helpful reference for the future. If you're stumped on how to remove a tree, thank you, Risa. Look at previous examples. So we've had some pretty complex situations where we're moving into how are we actually going to approach this? Do we need to get a crane? Are we working with heavy equipment from multiple sides of the river? And being able to look back and say, okay, we've removed a similar hazard in the past. This is how we did it. it's just a helpful reference to have for staff. They're also great training aids. You never know, you might be, presenting at a conference about removing river hazards, and you might need some photos in the future. And then they're great PR too. So for our public information officer for the agency, they love to push out when we've mitigated one of these hazards. It really shows the complex work that our agencies are doing to benefit the boating public. Finally, documentation helps with liability concern, with the caveat that I am not a lawyer and you should consult your legal counsel. But for our situation in Colorado, this shows good faith, that we are managing the river corridor in good faith, and that those removal efforts have been made for the benefit. It's not a guarantee that a mitigated hazard will never be a hazard ever again. We don't remove all of the material from the river every time, but as long as we're showing that we have made a good faith effort to mitigate that hazard to the best of our ability, our legal counsel has been that that is sufficient to cover our actions. It's also good for public scrutiny as well. We use a lot of chainsaws in our removal operations because that's something we do have the ability to use since we're not in a wilderness or wild and scenic area. But if we got a complaint about, why am I hearing this chainsaw running down by the river? We can have that documentation to show why it was necessary, demonstrating what the hazard was beforehand and what the good that came of that operation was. So that kind of closes out our life cycle section. And next, I just want to talk about a couple removal techniques. So some lessons we've learned at the Arkansas Headwaters is just always make a plan and be ready for that to change. You should be continuously reevaluating your removal plan all throughout your removal operation. Don't get locked into, yep, we made this plan, we're going to cut this tree and this one and then this one, and that's the way it's going to go. Be very flexible in these situations. They're dynamic, they're quickly changing. I like to simplify the problem first. So we make an initial plan. Maybe I'll hazard a guess at exactly what the day is going to look like, and sometimes that might even be right. But the first thing I want to do, especially if we're showing up to a complex tree hazard where we have multiple trees piled up together, is I want to remove all of the non-structural, all of the non-load-bearing wood from that situation. So cutting off all the little branches, all that extra noise and chaos in the situation. That really helped me simplify this down and look at the problem at exactly, what log do we need to move when to open this channel back up. And then moving logs to workable areas if you can as well. So you don't always need to work all the way out in the current. You might be able to swing like an 8-foot log, float that down the river on a rope and pull it to shore and then work on it there. And then finally, just like in a Swiftwater rescue situation, we never want to let ego or momentum run the show. Those are going to be our biggest hazards in dealing with these river hazards. Maintain that objective lens. If you're the one who's been, working really hard, running the saw, you're exhausted, you're tired, you're probably a little dehydrated, your ears are ringing a little bit. You might not be the most objective person to reevaluate. Should we stop now? Should we call it a day, come back tomorrow with a fresh head? So having someone who can maintain that objective view is really important. The kind of basic technique that we're going to use often here is ropes and saws. So this is a pretty lightweight and scalable approach, and it follows the KISS method, the keep it safe and simple. I like to think about a continuum of the complexity of our operation, just like in a Swiftwater rescue. We have that reach, throw, go, tow. Maybe before we start cutting and pulling on things with mechanical advantage, maybe we can just reach out and lift up that branch and pull it out by hand. In this picture on the right, this log was in a pretty nasty spot in Browns Canyon, pretty likely to produce swimmers above it, but very difficult to cut where it was. And we were actually able to pull not the angle we were in this one, but a little bit farther downstream to the right of the image, in line with that log, pulling, with the river working with us, pushing against that log, and just slide it out of the slot it was in, swing it over to shore, and then we could buck that up and work on it there. Considering the different tools you have at your disposal, a lot of our rangers will carry what we call a pocket chainsaw. It's just a chainsaw chain with a handle on either end. And that for a small, like we're out on a river patrol, we see a small hazard, anything under 8 or 9 inches in diameter, we might be able to quickly just mitigate that in the field with a little saw that we keep on us, all the way up to much more powerful chainsaws, and with hand saws and whatnot in between. Really consider the hardware strength when you're using ropes. So a throw bag it's going to be dynamic line. It's going to have some stretch to it. Most throw bags are going to be a smaller diameter. The breaking strength of that can be pretty easily reached when you're pulling on a heavy log in the river with the force of the river against it, especially if that starts to move. We don't want to have a rope system blow out, and now we have not just the log hazard moving down the river, but it has a bunch of nasty ropes attached to it as well. So using steel hardware and then static lines that have a much higher tensile strength if you're going to be doing more complex rope operations. Another advantage to using ropes and saws, if you're using hand saws, this is also a wilderness-friendly approach. Our kind of site cleanup considerations, I really like to do this right and do it once. So I don't want to cut on a log 10 times as it floats down the river. Just cutting the hazard part that's hanging out into the river, but knowing as the flow comes up, the next 10 feet of that log are going to get picked up and wedged somewhere else and somewhere else and somewhere else. If this is something that's going to be picked up as the water level increases, I'm going to buck up the entirety of that to the high water mark. So in this image on the right, you can see this is in Pine Creek Rapid. We generally cut our logs down to about a 28 to 30 inch length. That's short enough that it's not going to wedge itself in and become a strainer somewhere else, but long enough that you're still limiting the amount of cuts you're doing throughout the day. And then we actually leave those in place. We're not carrying these logs out. We want to leave that organic material in the ecosystem, let it decompose naturally and return that carbon to its normal life cycle. And then rather than kicking all of these logs out into the river as I'm bucking these 28-inch sections off, I'm leaving them in place. Yes, there's going to be some logs on the side of the river until the water comes up, but I'm not going to send 28-inch sections down the river all at the same time that are all going to stack up on the same cobble bar. As the water comes up, they'll naturally distribute and disappear. And then wherever they find themselves, they're creating macroinvertebrate habitat. They're giving that structure for macros to attach onto. Our kind of next scale up is heavy equipment use. So we have started using excavators a lot in our removal operations here. Advantages is you're making fewer cuts, and every time you fire up a chainsaw, there's a risk something could go wrong. The fewer cuts you have to do off the bow of a boat in moving current or straddling a log out in the middle of the river, the better. The flip side to that is with more power, there's more danger. These logs are heavier when they're moving around. If you're moving around an 8 to 16 foot log, the pull strength of that excavator is much stronger than I can pull even on a Z drag, and even chains can still break. So some of the only close call that I've had in my time was when we were kind of starting to use heavy equipment and getting to learn that process. And really, it was complacency on my part. That operation was so easy. What would have been probably a 3-day removal of what you see here. There were 5 or so of these trees crisscrossed back and forth across the river. If we had been using just hand power, it would have been a long, complex operation. We got it done in about half a day. But don't get complacent with how easy that is. There's still a lot of energy in that situation. And if that energy gets out of control, it can be very dangerous. Heavy equipment's definitely a force multiplier. Like I said, it can turn a multi-day operation into a half-day task. It decreases the amount of time you're on scene and decreases the amount of staff you need to work. And I'm sure we are all a little short-staffed and would love to have more hands available for more projects. If you don't have the equipment, rent it. So consider contractors. We have contracted out heavy equipment companies up to and including cranes when we've needed to remove some really large and heavy logs. Some special hazard considerations. Anytime there's hazmat in the river, you want to make sure that you have the proper PPE for your staff. So if we're dealing with motor oil, gasoline, etc., human waste, we want to make sure that we're still wearing dry suits, even if it's in the summer. But hazmat is an ecosystem risk. We have a gold medal fishery here on the Arkansas, and we don't want to leave a car in the river that's just draining oil into that fishery. So even if it's not as much of a hazard to boaters, we still want to remove that for its hazard to the fishery itself. But there's certain limitations that your equipment might have. For instance, if you're working around flammable fuels, you might not be able to use a chainsaw that could spark a fire. Working around vehicles in the river, vehicles are just really nasty strainers. They're undercut, they have sharp metal and glass, they introduce their own hazmat. Additionally, they can become unstable in unpredictable ways. So if the engine block is pointed upstream, that's generally better. But if the engine block is downstream, that means the lighter portion of that vehicle has the most force of the water on it, and it can rapidly spin and turn around on you. So we just want to be really careful when we're approaching vehicles in the river. Rockfall create all their own hazards. Much of what I've talked about today is talking about woody debris, but be particularly, pay attention to the risk of sieves in rockfall. Most of the time, we're not going to remove rockfall on the Arkansas. That is much harder to do and something that's really just not feasible. It also could have its own permitting considerations because now you're moving floodplain material around and you could need to have 404 permits to remove rocky debris from the river. Electricity, if you have a tree fall, especially in an urban area like some of ours, it might catch a power line and bring that into the river as well. So always make sure you're working with your utility companies and you're keeping your head on a swivel, really doing a full site evaluation and considering, is there electricity that's introduced into this as well? We've had that a couple of times. Final considerations I'll give just before moving to some questions here. Private property concerns. On the Arkansas, or in Colorado, the bed and banks of the river are private property. If it's private on both sides, and if it's public on one side and private on the other, it's to the center line of the river. That might not be the case in your state, so know your local laws on private property boundaries. But in this image, if this was private on both sides, we would need to obtain permission from the landowner to access this tree. Often the landowners are very willing to work with us because they have a real or perceived concern about the liability of a tree on their property, posing a hazard to the boating public. And I would really nurture those relationships in situations where you just know you're going to have more and more debris collected or falling in the future. We have a lot in our lower corridor. We have a lot of cottonwood groves on banks that are getting eroded by a wandering channel. So rather than waiting for that tree to fall, developing those relationships with landowners ahead of time, we have access agreements to spots where we just know there's going to be another big cottonwood that goes down there next high water year. And we know the gate code and they're totally fine with us being there. Finally, ditches often come up as well. We've had a lot of irrigation ditches. If you don't have irrigation on your rivers, you can totally disregard. But irrigation in the West, water law often takes some pretty strong precedent. And a lot of ditches get reported to our river hazard system, to our reporting sheet. Those are not something that we can mitigate due to the laws around ditches in Colorado. That said, a lot of ditch companies are willing to work with the industry. They recognize, in Chaffee County, there's a $60 million impact of the whitewater boating industry. They want to work with us and try to make that ditch still serve their purposes properly, but allow for all that economic impact that the whitewater industry brings to this river corridor. Right. Next, I'll open it up just to questions that you all might have and conversation.
Thank you, Jeff. This was the best. This was so great. I've never seen a description of process like this. It's fantastic. Thank you. So now, even though it's low water, so it is normal here, you would have a big influx of paddlers from the last half of May, Memorial Day through the end of June, or maybe the last week in June. So because you mentioned all the different ways that you hear about hazards and then you communicate them out. How would Joe Blow, who's just driven out from Chicago and is out for a week, how are they likely to hear about a hazard? You mentioned sandwich boards, so maybe that's where you definitely catch them, but they might not always be at a super, like at the slider ramp. They might not be at a super popular place. Say they're at anyway, say they're doing the numbers, it's kind of, or Pine Creek or something. How would you hope that they would hear about it?
Yeah, that's there. We have a lot of private put-ins as well. So even putting out sandwich boards, even if folks are putting in right next to one, it may come as a surprise, but people don't read signs. So that's really why we try to use as many different methods as we can, whether it's those listservs, Facebook groups, signage, just chatting with people at boat ramps. When we have river rangers out on patrol, if they're setting safety at a rapid, kind of stationed in one spot, just distributing that information to boaters as they pass by. But it is a very porous river corridor for us here, so getting information to the right people is evergreen challenge.
Yeah. I'm thinking average boater would probably find an outfitter. They would probably drop in an outfitter anyway, right, somewhere when they get to town. Here's a question from Val. How long has the Google system been in place? About how long did it take to get people on board with the method? Thank you. This is great.
Yeah, we started that in 2023, I believe, was the first date on there. I think it was later in 2023 after the boating season, but kind of in that winter period where we're getting a lot of like deadfall from snow weight. And it's a continuous process to get people on board with it. The outfitters who are used to email in the office, if that's still what they're going to do, I'm not going to ignore the report that comes in via email. We'll just enter it in the form as well. And we just continue to mention it and push it out to folks. One of the things I did is just pinned it to our Facebook page. So it is the top post on our Facebook page at all times. So that way it's kind of right there front of mind for folks. But yeah, it's definitely not the exclusive channel that we get reports through, 2.5, 3 years in. But we have gotten a decent amount of reports through it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, this is fantastic. Any other questions? You got some good thumbs up here. This is just the best. Jeff, thank you so much for preparing this all. And I know some people are going to take this home with them. Well, this will be recorded, everybody, and be really great for you to have it. If anyone has questions afterwards and you can't figure out how to find Jeff or get the question, just ask anybody who's been involved, me or James or anything. We'll get it.
Thank you very much. This was a really cool presentation. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, thank you all for taking the time and being here today. I have my information up on
there we go.
The final slide here. So that's email address and then cell phone as well. So feel free to call or text that. And then I would also just invite you all to come out and join us on the Arkansas. I'd love to get out on the river, do a boating patrol with folks from other river systems and learn from you all as well.
Cool. We might get taken up on that. Awesome. Thank you. Thank you everyone for attending today. This is great.